Welcome back, ear nerds. Today I'm going to talk about scale length, especially from the point of view of ergonomics. Does it make the guitar easier to play if you have a shorter scale guitar? Let's cover a couple of basic things about scale length first. Scale length is the distance between the bridge and nut on your guitar. Traditionally, Fender style guitars are 25.5 inches. Gibson guitars 24.75 inches, and PRS in the middle at 25 inches. If you want to measure your guitar, the easiest way to do it is to measure from the nut to the 12th fret and then double it. When thinking about scale length, there are two main ergonomic factors to consider. Firstly, fret to fret distance, and secondly, string tension. Let's deal with fret to fret distance first. Frets on a guitar get closer together the further and further you move up the neck towards the bridge. This is to do with the basic physics of the relationship between string length and pitch. So, for example, the distance between fret 1 and fret 5 is a lot further than the distance between fret 12 and fret 17. However, a guitar with a longer scale length will have a greater distance between the same two fret positions than one with a shorter scale length. So, for example, if your fingers have to stretch from the 3rd fret to the 7th fret, that distance is going to be further on a Fender style guitar than on a Gibson style guitar. You will have to decide for yourself whether this is a big difference for you. But from my own personal point of view, I've always found it difficult to stretch that distance, that 5 fret distance, on guitars that I've owned, and any advantage that I can get to not have to stretch my hands out so far is helpful. When I do stretch them that far, I often find it tricky, and you're more prone to string buzz when you can't quite reach to the fret that you want to get to. So how far is it exactly, and how different are the commonest scale lengths? Because I'm a nerd, I did some comparisons using the StewMac calculator and created a big spreadsheet to compare every single fret distance. But I have to be honest, the spreadsheet isn't all that easy to understand, as it's got a huge number of numbers on it. So I think it's going to be easier if we just look at one specific distance. So if you take the 25.5 inch scale length as your starting point and look at the distance between fret 3 and fret 7, which for me is quite a stretch, that's a 5 fret span. And on a Fender style guitar, that distance is 112.4 millimeters. Now, in fact, your fingers don't have to stretch exactly that far because they're not exactly on the frets. But let's use that distance as a reference point to compare. So for a PRS style guitar, which is 25 inches, that distance from the 3rd fret to the 7th fret is 110.2 millimeters. So that's 2.2 millimeters less of a stretch. For a Gibson style guitar, that stretch is 108.9 millimeters. That's 3.5 millimeters shorter across the 5 frets. Those numbers seem small, but when you add the fact that sometimes you may be fretting at an angle across the fretboard, then it begins to add up. So the issue when you're stretching is the last fret. How near can you get to that last 7th fret if you're stretching from the 3rd? So let's have a look at the distance between fret 6 and fret 7. On a Fender style guitar, the distance between 6 and 7 is 25.7 millimeters. So moving to a Gibson scale length gets you 14% closer to the 7th fret than you were with a traditional Fender scale length. So when you look at it like that, moving from a 25.5 inch scale length to a 24 3/4 scale length gives you about a 15% advantage in terms of just making that last stretch to the last fret that you need to get to. Now I have to say that that's an advantage worth having as long as everything else is equal. Now of course I'm referring to the elephant in the room, which is the tone of scale length. Now Jim Lill, I'm not going into that here, but Jim Lill did a great video about the comparison of tone across scale lengths, and when I watched that video, my conclusion is that it really doesn't matter. There are other things that are much, much bigger. In fact, I did a comparison myself of some single coil neck pickups playing the same riff. I'll link to it above, but the conclusion of that is, if you watch that video, all of those guitars are Gibson scale length or PRS scale length, and there is no noticeable difference in tone. Anyway, we'll leave that topic for another day maybe. So that was part one of the analysis. The second big factor on ergonomics and scale length is string tension. How tight are the strings? To do this, I used an online string tension calculator. Now I need to say before we start that different string materials and different manufacturing processes end up with different tensions. So I've compared standard sets of Ernie Ball strings. And because we can generate a lot of different numbers, I think the easiest way we can do this is by looking at the high E string on the guitar and comparing just that string across the different scales. If you have a 9 gauge E string on a Fender scale guitar, the string tension is 58.5 newtons. If you then put a 10 gauge string on the same guitar, the tension will go up to 71.1 newtons. That's an increase of 21%. Now that makes sense. Thicker strings feel tighter. If you do the same on a Gibson guitar, you have different tensions, but basically the difference between 9 and 10 gauge is also 21%. So now let's do the comparison between a 9 gauge string on a Fender guitar and a 9 gauge string on a Gibson guitar. So you can see on screen, a Fender scale guitar has 58.5 newtons with a 9 gauge E string, and a Gibson scale guitar has 55.1. Honestly, that is a smaller difference than I would have expected. It's a difference of about 6% and seems quite small to me. Just one other comparison. I think it's quite common for people to use a 9 gauge E string on a Fender scale guitar and a 10 gauge on a Gibson. So let's just quickly compare the string tensions of those two. 10 gauge on a Gibson scale is 67 newtons and 9 gauge on a Fender scale is 58.5. So a 9 on a Fender is definitely less tight, looser than 10s on a Gibson. Personally, I've always felt that using a 10 on a Gibson scale is equally comfortable to using a 9 on a Fender, but these numbers show that the 9s probably are easier to bend and so on. So what does all of this mean for your playing comfort and your ability to play more easily? Firstly, how much do you play that really requires a 5-fret stretch? I can only really think of two examples. One is if you do 3-note per string scales, and secondly is if you're fretting complex chords, so something like Andy Summers in Every Breath You Take, or maybe Mr. Brightside that has some difficult stretching to do. Otherwise, it's going to be pretty rare that you're stretching across more than 4 frets. For most of us, I would say a 4-fret stretch is pretty easy unless you have unusually small hands, but you have to factor in that when you're fretting complex chords over 4 frets, then it may be difficult to stretch because your fingers are all in different directions. So although the numbers show there is only a small advantage, I still think that it is more comfortable and easier to play on a shorter scale guitar, and that advantage from fret 3 to 7 is almost 15% of that, getting that last bit of reach to get close to the fret that you need to get to play cleanly. My conclusion overall is there are hardly any downsides to doing this, and if it helps you to play cleanly, then all to the good. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you got something out of the video, please, it would help the channel if you clicked like, and if you'd like to see more nerdy content like this in the future, please hit that subscribe button, and I look forward to seeing you in future videos. Thanks for watching. See you next time.